What's up, y'all? Gonna be doing a top 16 list between all the Street Fighters from weakest to strongest. You already know I'm gonna be using the main guides. Y'all ready? Got my buddy Ivan taking up the first 8. So without any further ado, let's get this thing started.
At number 16, we have Zangief, the Russian bad guy, the Red Cyclone, the nigga that used to walk around in a spandex with no socks, shoes, not even a shirt. With his massive popularity during the 1990s during the events of the Street Fighter Alpha and Street Fighter 2 era, unfortunately canonically within the lore of Street Fighter, he didn't do so well within the World Warrior tournament, both in main continuity or in the Uran comics. And despite putting up a good fight in the tournament, he ultimately suffered a ring out by Ryu, with ultimately being defeated by Ryu's Hadouken. And may I remind you, this would be the same Hadouken that Zangief would continue to complain about with many other characters learning the technique years later. And although Zangief, through many other games after the events of the Street Fighter 2 era, would become a far more formidable opponent within the franchise and within the main cast, unfortunately during the Street Fighter 2 era, he unfortunately ranks at the very low end of the list. Sorry, Zangief fans. Wish he was a lot higher during this era, but he will be, in the future. At the number 15 spot is Balrog. Yes, before so many comments, I know that he was originally called Mike Bison to imitate Iron Mike Tyson during his initial run as heavyweight champion of the world from 1986 to 1990, but his name is Balrog now. Get over it. Balrog is without a doubt a very interesting character to say the least within the Street Fighter franchise as a whole, as he more so would act as one of the many antagonists that the main cast of the Street Fighter franchise would have to deal with. However, in context to the Street Fighter 2 War Warrior tournament, the only reason why during this era he is not regarded as dead last, or at the very least the weakest among the characters, is due to the numerous upon numerous statements that establish his striking power being unmatched amongst the cast. However, that's clearly hyperbole, as there are numerous characters amongst this list and throughout the franchise that are just blatantly superior to him. So despite having such statements, which would really only be relevant towards him and other fighters using his similar boxing fighting style, unfortunately in comparison to the rest of the cast, he's just a lot lower in this list. Coming in at number 14 for this spot is the legendary E Honda, one of the many, and I'm not kidding, many recognizable face of the Street Fighter franchise, especially in comparison to Ryu, with one of their many popular locations to fight being heavily well known within the fighting game world and just in video game history in general, of which during the Street Fighter 2 era, E Honda would take notice that DiCapri's fighting style, more so in contrast to her strength and her speed, would heavily remind her of another character that he had fought years prior during the Street Fighter era, which was clearly a reference to how she fights similar to Cammy. With her being the same character who progressed far higher in the tournament in comparison to E Honda, it would be pretty safe to say that she would be pretty comfortably above E Honda in comparison. So it's pretty comfortable to say that E Honda lost early in the tournament, of which coming at number 13 would be that of Blanka, the Brazilian Sparkplug, of which we see during the Street Fighter 2 era for Blanka in his ending art, of which we see him fighting somewhat relative to characters in that of Dhalsim and Ryu, but still ultimately losing. However, Blanka being this powerful during the Street Fighter 2 entering into the Street Fighter 4 era is pretty consistent, as Blanka will be one of the many characters in the Street Fighter franchise who has a pretty good understanding of how everybody else fights within the franchise, as well as their main set and their abilities. It's never fully established within the lore whether or not he had a decisive win in either the main continuity or within the Uran comic book storyline for this tournament. He was still pretty capable of being able to contend with some of the mid-tiers that were of this era at the time before the tournament ended, of which would also give other characters just like Jimmy in that same tier bracket alongside Blanka. So it's a win-win, I guess. And of which, coming in at number 12 is T-Hawk, a man who, aside from characters such as Chun-Li or Judy, has probably lost the most from Shadowloo against any other character within the franchise. It is confirmed during the Street Fighter 4 era, during one of the recordings that was released from the game, when T-Hawk entered into the tournament, he indeed fought characters in that of Guile, of which both Guile and T-Hawk during this era at the time were capable of fighting relative toward each other during the tournament, with T-Hawk inevitably landing the final blow against Guile, with both of them then exchanging words toward each other before going off in their own separate ways with their own separate missions within life. And while during the tournament they did stalemate toward each other, it's narratively implied within the Street Fighter 4 era that T-Hawk was indeed slightly weaker and that he needed to get stronger in order to save Julia. And unfortunately, due to statements such as this, it's pretty blatantly clear that T-Hawk would land in the number 12th spot within this list of the strongest characters during the Street Fighter 2 era, of which coming in at number 11 would be characters in that of Dee Jay, a warrior from Jamaica who combines martial arts with breakdancing. Kinda similar to how Street Fighter 6's Jamie is capable of being able to mix, well, breakdancing with kung fu. Dee Jay would be the same character during the Street Fighter Alpha trilogy, which I have to preface, yes, is canon, would be the same character who would inevitably battle characters in that of Sagat. And although he did lose to Ken in the tournament pretty early on, Dee Jay would be the same character who references how in the Street Fighter 4 era that Ken had a lot more firepower in the past prior to slightly getting out of shape, as he was more focused on running his company and being a husband and a potential father. Although such statements from Dee Jay about Ken Masters is very questionable, as Ken is the same character who has narratively and consistently showcased the best relativity to characters not Ryu, since both Ryu and Ken are eternal rivals and are practically even with each other on almost everything. Regardless, such feats and statements would pretty comfortably put Dee Jay at 11th place in comparison to the rest of the cast of the Street Fighter 2 era. Finally, entering into the top 10, we have characters in that of Fei Long. Yes, Street Fighter's Bruce Lee copy. Nah, but for real, Fei Long is a very powerful character, and obviously, as we can see from design, fighting style, and through some of the mechanics that are heavily inspired by the legendary martial artist in that of Bruce Lee. With Fei Long being the same character during the Street Fighter Alpha era, being the same person who was capable of being able to defeat characters such as Balrog and Vega during the tournament, running into characters in that of Blanka, and then unfortunately losing to characters in that of Ryu, which is no surprise, as Ryu and Fei Long had fought each other in the past, and unfortunately Ryu besting him. And although losing to Ryu inevitably during the tournament, Fei Long is also the same character with numerous upon numerous statements that establish his overall mastery and his understanding of the very concept of martial arts in general. So despite being physically weaker than some of the other characters in the top 10, his knowledge in martial arts period is pretty blatantly nearly unmatched. Nearly. At number 9 being that of the Master of Yoga, Dhalsim, one of the many few characters within the Street Fighter franchise who had achieved enlightenment. And although his natural pacifism is the reason why it is never verbatim stated whether or not he had any confirmed wins during the tournament, he is still the same character who during this era who has fought pretty much nearly every protagonist within the franchise. Although he would inevitably be defeated by Guile during the tournament, of which was ultimately due to his reaction of him of the Street Fighter 4 tournament about overcoming his lust for revenge and his reaction towards him into the tournament, where his son Danta name drops Guile's daughter's name, with Dhalsim showing his concern for Guile. And although despite losing to Guile during the Street Fighter 2 era, he would also be the same character who would become massively more powerful throughout the franchise, as once again he would be one of the few characters that would have achieved enlightenment, and as well would be one of the many key players during the Street Fighter 4, 5, and 3 era respectively. So while he may be lower in the list in the top 10 during the Street Fighter 2 era, that doesn't mean he's weak currently. Don't get it twisted.
Cammy and Chun-Li. Chun-Li and Cammy. Though these two have often been debated on who's the strongest over the years, they've often been argued as being interchangeable as well. But it should be mentioned that these two in Street Fighter 2 canonically interacted on a friendly basis. Given the fact of the promotional art of them meeting in a non-confrontational way, and the in-game turbo cutscene is shown in the exact same way. Cammy is shown multiple times to fight against superior opponents in Alpha 3, being Vega. While losing the first round, she awakens to her true self and defeats Vega to escape to find Bison. Upon meeting Bison, she is then ambushed by the dolls. She beats both Junie and Julie, as well as fighting Bison himself and escaping temporarily. Now, the best you can argue for Chun-Li is beating Balrog, and we know she beats Balrog by her dialogue against him in Street Fighter 4, and her addressing him by name in Balrog's rival intro. She wins to progress to the other 4 kings, only to lose to Ken leading up to the finals. Also, the point in beating Balrog isn't really impressive, as Balrog gets slammed by a Fei Long that just debuted, as well as a Mika that just debuted. His best feat is beating Birdie in Alpha 3, which is the same thing Chun-Li did prior to Balrog's arrival, so it really doesn't do much for her scaling or her placement in the tiers. Also, not even to mention the what if ending in Street Fighter V if Cammy never broken away from her brainwashing. She'd literally end up one-shotting Chun-Li. So yeah, not a good argument. So yes, you can argue Chun-Li could perform similarly, but nothing supports that she's above Cammy whatsoever, cementing Chun's place in 8th and Cammy's place in 7th, respectively. Guile, the man on a mission to avenge his fallen friend, Charlie Nash. Guile has consistently shown to be above the likes of Chun-Li and Cammy. Firstly, Guile beating Chun-Li in Alpha 3 is pretty blatant evidence in and of itself, but also, Guile beat Charlie, the same Charlie that beat Cammy in Alpha 3. Even if we look into a bit in the future, when those 3 confront Jury, Guile performs the best out of the 3, as Jury states multiple times that Guile made her try and actually hurt her, when Cammy didn't push Jury to this same point, and we already know what happened to Chun-Li, thus submitting Guile's place at a solid number 6. Vega, the sadistic matador, would be relative to Guile, as they both are comparable with being in the same tier above characters like Cammy or Chun-Li. We even see in Street Fighter V where Vega directly challenges Guile and pushes him back several feet, preventing him from saving Chun-Li from Bison's attack. Even though they both get stronger over the events of Street Fighter 4 and to 5 from the events of 2, this would still be consistent with their scaling throughout the timeline, which would give Vega the slight edge, thus cementing him as a solid number 5. It's confirmed that the hot-headed Kid Masters faces the Spaniard in the Street Fighter 4 Aftermath video and promptly defeated him so bad that by the time of the SIN tournament, Chun-Li thought that Vega had died, showing that there is quite a gap in strength between these 3. So obviously, Kid Masters gaps and is at a really solid number 4. The Emperor of Muay Thai, Sagat, was shown in Alpha 3 to be able to knock around a psycho-powered amped Ryu and get him back to his senses, something that Ken wasn't able to do when he himself was amped by psycho power and fought a base Ryu, and Ryu was actually able to KO him. It's also stated in multiple guides that by the time the World Warrior tournament had come around, Sagat had trained so much that he was only second to Bison himself in terms of power. And this is just generally better than anything Ken has shown up until this point. Thus, the Emperor takes number 3 on the list. The big bad, the Lord of Shadowloo himself, Master Bison. Not only in multiple guides is he stated to be the outright strongest between all the 4 Grandmasters, but by the time of Street Fighter 2, his power was beyond Charlie's imagination, someone who's fought and stalemated Bison before in the Alpha period. Afterwards, he's known as the strongest fighter ever up until that point, and no one being able to truly dethrone him, thus easily cementing Bison as the number 2 pick for the list. The Endless Wanderer, the man who never stops fighting, the warrior with an unyielding desire for the answer, the original Street Fighter, Ryu. Come on now, part of you had to see this coming, right? Not only did Ryu outskill several opponents with his Hadokens alone, but he defeated several top tiers in the Alpha 3 period, such as Fei Long and Guile, but even previous opponents like Sagat and Bison, who he struggled with previously, got slammed. Also, not to mention that all the guides imply that he's the best fighter there, with the most balanced skill set. So obviously, the winner goes to the man with the Dragon Punch, It goes to ignoring the red-headed demon in the room. Obviously, coming in and off-guarding and slamming Bison to death, requiring him to get a whole nother body for Street Fighter 4. And possibly entertaining Ryu for a bit before Bison takes off. Akuma is in a tier, especially at this point, all on his own. So Akuma would be tier 0 on this list.
Speak for yourself, I actually have Ken over fucking Sagat, let alone the fact that Ken beat Sagat during the Street Fighter Alpha era and was shown capable of beating Ryu twice during the Street Fighter Alpha and early stages of the Street Fighter 2 era, of which we see Ken blatantly one-shot evil Ryu during the Ryu and Akuma books. Ken would just logically be the same person who should be capable of beating Sagat during the Street Fighter 2 tournament, not to mention, again, during this era, both Ken and Ryu were pretty blatantly equals toward each other, with both Ken and Ryu training together in the Ryu and Akuma books to prepare for this tournament, of which both of them were evenly matched. So since we know that Ken should logically be above Sagat due to his numerous victories over Sagat, Ken should logically also be above Sagat in this fucking list. I'm sorry. I know this is your list, Gnosis, but I'm sorry. I gotta put in my 2 cents, especially post Street Fighter 2, as Ken's the same character who, once again, is capable of sparring and fighting relative to Ryu numerous times, with Ryu usually being one of the strongest of the protagonists of the franchise, point blank period. I wholeheartedly will always say that Ken is above Sagat. You cannot change my mind otherwise. Sorry, not sorry.